didn't have any history of mental illness. The only thing that made me anything but average was my willingness to participate in the study. I was lucky to go to a nicer hospital. Some of the other participants went to pretty shabby places. The quality of the hospital didn't concern any of us, though. We all thought we'd get in and out in a matter of days. None of us were crazy after all. Like Rosenhan told me, I called and made an appointment with the hospital I'd be admitted to. None of the doctors or nurses knew that I was totally sane. To them, I was just another patient. During my appointment, I complained of hearing voices. I told the doctor that the voices seemed to be saying words like empty, hollow, and thud, as if they reflected some unconscious belief of mine that my life was meaningless. All of the other participants complained of the same symptoms. I guess Rosenhan thought that mentioning symptoms of existential psychosis would make the article he was writing on the experiment more interesting. I was admitted to the psychiatric ward right after my appointment. I got my own room and everything. It was a little nerve-wracking. I didn't think I'd be admitted so easily. My biggest fear was that I'd be exposed as a fraud immediately. But that definitely didn't happen. After I was admitted, I completely stopped complaining of any symptoms. Rosenhan told me and all the other participants to stop reporting symptoms and behave normally as soon as we got in. During my first checkup, I told the doctor that I felt totally normal again. She seemed pretty underwhelmed by that. I knew it would take a bit more convincing, but I was sure that I'd be able to get out of the hospital by my own devices in the next few days. Once my initial exams were over, I was called to one of the doctor's offices to receive a diagnosis. Schizophrenia, they said. He told me I'd be treated for it for the duration of my stay in the institution. I wasn't sure how long the diagnosis would stick, but it still made me nervous. Rosenhan predicted that the diagnosis would cloud others' perceptions of my behavior, that once I'd been labeled, there'd be little I could do to overcome the tag. I hoped he was wrong. Even after my false diagnosis, I did my best to be a model patient. I quickly responded to any instructions the staff gave me. I even responded to the nurses' calls for medication. I didn't take the medication, of course. Rosenhan told me to pretend to take it, but then to spit it out into the sink as soon as the nurses left. So I at least appeared to be happy and healthy as a person at that point. Or so I thought. Like I was supposed to, I got in a pretty good habit of writing down my observations about the place. Rosenhan wanted me to do this secretly, so I did for a while. After several days, though, I realized that no one was paying any attention to me or my notepad. I don't think anyone even cared enough to notice. So I started writing down my observations wherever I made them. Sometimes I'd sit in the day room and write for hours. There was nothing else to do anyway. I didn't hide my behavior anymore, but still, no one realized what I was doing. I guess no one cares about a schizophrenic's secrets. During one of my regular interviews, it became painfully obvious that no matter how sane I acted, no one amongst the hospital staff was going to notice that I was in fact not a schizophrenic and didn't really belong in this mental institution. I was physically fit and healthy, but their questions remained on the mental plane and were so general that any true concerns about my mental health were never truly explored. One nurse who interviewed me kept asking me about my mother, my relationship with her, and then with my father as I grew older. I initially found her questions to be rather obvious, so I gave an honest and obvious answer. My upbringing would normally not have suggested anything troubling or psychologically interesting, but later, upon gaining access to the notes from my sessions, Dr. Rosenhan discovered that the psychoanalyst had made false assumptions about my home life based off my diagnosis. What would have been seen as normal behavior in a non-clinical setting was now seen as mentally disturbed or psychologically distorted. Meaning was ascribed to my verbal statements that could only be attributed to my misdiagnosis as schizophrenic. The other patients and I were commonly misunderstood by the staff. The staff almost always believed that behaviors that were stimulated by the environment were a symptom of the patient's disorders. One day, as I paced the hall, a nurse asked if I was feeling nervous. In actuality, I was just bored. Being bored was a regular part of my day at the hospital. It felt like I had been there for years at this point. I had basically given up the idea that I'd be exposed as a fraud. But one day in the day room, a patient actually confronted me. She sat down across from me and said something like, "You're not crazy. You're just some inspector checking up on the hospital." I was shocked. Pretty soon, about a third of the patients in the ward suspected me of being sane. One guy told everyone I was a journalist. Another person said I was some kind of professor studying the ward. This actually happened to 2 other participants in their own hospitals. For some reason, I was really surprised that anyone called me out. I guess it had just been so long with no suspicion. Even with the patient's accusations, still no one in the staff doubted that I was insane. Rosenhan later explained to me that this demonstrated the staff's bias towards something called type 2 error. That's when physicians are more likely to call a healthy person sick than to misdiagnose a sick person as healthy. They always want to err on the side of caution. That makes sense, but I still think it was ridiculous that they called me crazy even after I was called out. Rosenhan and I both wondered if a sane person could even be detected at all given the ideals of the doctors and nurses. One afternoon, I witnessed a staff member beating a patient for starting a conversation with him. Another time, a patient was beaten in front of others for approaching the staff and saying, "I like you." The punishments, no matter how excessive, appeared to go unquestioned, and tempers were often short. Abusive behavior only stopped when other staff members were coming. Staff members were credible witnesses. Patients were not. Powerlessness was evident everywhere. As part of a secondary experiment, Rosenhan arranged another set of experiments at research and teaching hospitals, coordinating with hospital officials to test the theory of misdiagnosis based on predisposed assumptions. The experiment would be performed on staff who had heard about Rosenhan's previous experiment and findings, but were skeptical that such phenomenon could take place. The diagnostic staff was informed that during a 3-month period, pseudo-patients would be entering their facilities in an attempt to be admitted. The clinicians were told to rate patients on a 10-point scale, with 1 or 2 reflecting a high confidence that the patient was part of the experiment. 193 patients were interviewed. All of them entered for psychiatric treatment. The staff who had extended contact with the patients were all asked to rate them on a scale, making an evaluation on their possible identity as a pseudo-patient. Out of the 193 patients interviewed in the process, 41 of them were alleged, with high confidence, to be a pseudo-patient part of the experiment, 23 of those by at least one psychiatrist, and 19 of them by one psychiatrist and another staff member. In reality, none of the patients admitted were part of any experiment. All were real patients seeking psychiatric help. I have attempted several times to initiate conversation with the staff. Though I exhibited normal behavior, every conversation would either be cut off or completely ignored. The most bizarre encounter was between myself and one of the doctors. No matter what I said, he replied with, "Good morning. How are you today?" and just kept walking. As soon as I entered the psychiatric hospital, I wanted to be released. Though I was regarded as friendly and exhibited no abnormal behavior, I was kept hospitalized for a month. Eventually, I convinced the staff that I was in remission and discharged. Even though I was discharged, the label was still there. I was schizophrenic. The mental health ward was a place to lose your identity, not build a better one. The hierarchy of the psychiatric hospital facilitated depersonalization more than any other place I've ever been. How else could a psych ward be run? I don't even think Rosenhan knows that. There are already constraints on finances and staffing that make it difficult to maintain it in the first place. The biggest sources of depersonalization, though, are the attitudes and beliefs that professionals in the institution hold towards patients. Even the ones with good intentions have attitudes characterized by fear, distrust, and horrible expectations. Worse still, some of them just don't care at all. They rely so much on hands-off treatments like medication and never spend time with the patients to help them recover. All that happens at these places is that patients go in, get labeled, take drugs, and leave after obeying enough orders from the staff. Rosenhan doesn't even think these people know what they're doing anymore. It's depressing to think how many people have been mistreated in this psych ward only to lose their privileges of citizenship after they've been diagnosed and released. Rosenhan said that type 2 error in psychiatric diagnosis does not have the same consequences as it does in medical diagnosis. Psychiatric diagnosis brings about permanent social stigma towards the person suffering. Can't they see how much that hurts people? Addressing the issue of type 2 error is incredibly difficult. The hospitals themselves obviously impose an environment in which the meanings of behavior can be easily misunderstood. I don't know exactly how this can be remedied, but I hope that someone figures it out once Rosenhan presents his research. I know he thinks that educating the mental health community and encouraging behavioral therapies will help. The main principle he wants to illustrate is that mental health professionals are more sensitive to an individual's behavior than they are to the contextual stimuli that promote it. He calls this the fundamental attribution error. Rosenhan also says that we can't blame the professionals in the hospital completely for the mistakes they've made. Their perceptions and behavior were influenced by the situation too. Within an improved structure of mental health care, their perceptions and behaviors might change for the better. No matter where you are, make sure that you're watching the situation you think you're controlling. It might be controlling you.